And your life.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, wherever the heck in the world you are. It is time again. It's that time. It's Monday. It's 10 a.m. on the Eastern Seaboard. And because it's 10 a.m. on the Eastern Seaboard, you know what time it is? It's time for the Sirius Report. It's time to get serious about geopolitical events. And the best way to do that is get the premium subscriber service that Paul offers over at thesiriusreport.com. And Sirius spelled Sirius. Am I correct, Paul?
That's correct.
All right, good. I got a little foggy this morning for half a second. My brain just stopped functioning. I'm like, how do I spell? So this thesiriusreport.com. Check them out and subscribe for the premium services. Having your own presidential briefing, intelligence briefing every morning with London Paul. With that being said, sir, what's going on? How are you?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Yeah, I'm very well. And yourself?
I'm hanging in there, Paul. I'm well rested. I've been asleep since yesterday at 3 p.m. I think I hit the pillow, and I didn't wake up till 6 a.m. this morning. It was wonderful.
Fantastic.
So to say that I'm well rested is an understatement of the century, Paul. I'm fired up.
Excellent. So yeah, where should we start?
Why don't we do this, man? Like, yes, this morning, and I know you were in the chat room. Like you and I always say this: when you want to take the cabal out, you're not going to rip the whole entire cabal up. It's like in the example I gave was the whole tumor thing, right? When the tumor's so big, you try to rip it out, you're going to kill the patient. Like we all seen the documentary, the woman with the 50-pound tumor. We've seen that. If you haven't, go check it out. It's disgusting. But anyway, you can't when the cabal and its systems have grown and festered to the size that it is. The best way to do it is to cut off the blood supply little by little by little and let it have it, like what you said, wither on the vine. That is the best way.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also to make people understand that when you want to implement new systems, you just can't simply go ahead and do that. Otherwise, you're going to have tens of millions of people unemployed.
Absolutely. I think this is a great starting point, and we'll pick the baton up from what you were saying, which is absolutely the case. The problem is, there's a lot of people in the alternative media who've given this impression that all you simply have to do is turn up at the White House, throw out the president. Well, obviously not Trump in this case, but some people still want Trump thrown out. But from the Obama administration, that we're going to have all these mass arrests, and we're going to have the militia turning up, and then we're going to declare war on, well, not exactly sure who, the U.S. military or Washington. I mean, and the reality is, if that had ever happened, the risk is, and you rightly pointed out, you'd have tens of millions of US citizens dying.
Right.
And the last thing the US needs is a civil war. And that kind of mentality is just conducive to a civil war. And you're absolutely right. If you look at how the cabal were taken down, and we just sort of move a bit east to start with. Russia and China didn't sit there going, right, well, we're going to declare war on the US, or we're going to declare war on the UK or the City of London or Wall Street or the Pentagon or the US or the UK military. What we're going to have to do is we have to build our own infrastructure, which effectively, as you rightly point out, it's a great analogy, it starts to drain the blood supply. So what did they do? They went, well, let's create the AIIB. Let's create alternative payment systems like SIPS and MIR. Let's create the new development bank. Let's start reigniting the One Belt, One Road. Let's go around the world, and which the Chinese and the Russians have done for the last 3 years, signing deals here, there, and everywhere, and de-dollarizing in the process, knowing full well it's a long gestation, but it's the way you have to go about it. You can't go and fight a war, and that's precisely what they want, is a war. I mean, that's exactly what they tried to do in Ukraine, is to generate the conditions. So Russia would go in and create a third world war scenario, and the Russians cleverly went, well, we're not going to fall for that. So that's their agenda, that's their mantra. Let them do that, because they're not succeeding and they won't succeed. So that's what the East's done. And obviously we've seen how we're now starting to see moves in Europe, where Europe's starting to change. And who would have believed that now Germany's threatening the US with sanctions? I mean, you're starting to see this huge change in the geopolitical structure within Europe. And in terms of the US, you're absolutely right. What the US needs to do is start to reindustrialize. It needs to start to make friends with Russia and China, which privately they very much are doing. I mean, a little bit more publicly with with the Chinese, but obviously less so with the Russians for obvious reasons. But it's that understand that's what they need to do. It's the reindustrialize the US. And it's rather like you can't go and decide to shut all the banks down because we know the banks are full of huge problems. We know the Federal Reserve's extremely corrupt, but they're just they're the proxy agents for the Exchange Stabilization Fund who never get talked about. No one really knows what they do, but that's the dark heart of the US financial system. And the list goes on. You can't go and challenge these people and just say, right, well, we'll shut all the banks down, because then what happens? Chaos ensues within the United States. And in that process, you're going to stir up a lot of people who are going to get very frightened and do very, very crazy, stupid things, which is equally going to be more detrimental to the nation. Now, there is, of course, a risk, as we all know, and you pointed out earlier, which is absolutely true. The real US economy is finished. It's over. It's been destroyed. I mean, that all the true economic statistics prove that, not the illusion that obviously the Feds pump out every month, 2 months, 3 months, and all the other statistics that comes out on a weekly basis. We know that's an illusion, but we know the real economy is destroyed. But the point is, you've got to try and turn that around. And yes, there is a risk, of course, that in trying to turn the oil tank around and go in the right direction, that everything does crash and implode, and to some extent, and yet at some point, realistically, the markets are going to eviscerate. There's no doubt about it, because we know full well it's held up by complete hot air, and as you rightly pointed out, algos have ruled the roost and derivatives have ruled the roost for the last well over a decade. I mean, it's accelerated in recent years, but I think it started in kind of early 2000s in earnest. So these are the problems you have to counteract, and you can't just have this idea, well, we'll just go in, drop bombs everywhere and hope everything turns out well in the long run. And you're absolutely right. Whatever people feel about Trump, and yes, we'll praise Trump where he does the right things. We'll criticize him where he doesn't. He's got a very difficult job. And yes, I've said it many times, it is a wrecking ball that's been applied to the cabal. But equally, there is a conscience where he doesn't want to do too much damage, and he is trying to turn the United States around. Now, whether he can do that before bigger problems happen remains to be seen. But that's the idea, because sinking everything.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no good saying to the American people, well, we've saved you from the cabal, and then the United States is in utter turmoil. They're going to turn around and go, what the hell have you done? You've destroyed our nation.
Yeah.
And that's rather like Russia and China can't be seen to destroy the US economy. I mean, people say, and the gold and silver market, great example. We saw today 300 tons of paper dumped in the market, which only moved the gold price, $15, big deal. But people get frustrated to own physical metal, going, well, when is this ever going to end? Well, at some point, of course, it will end. And yes, the Chinese could arbitrage and say we're going to reprice the physical gold at $2,000 an ounce and burn the COMEX and the LBMA overnight. But if they're seen to do that, that's hugely detrimental to the Chinese. So what do the Chinese do? They do what they do best. They say, well, we'll set up the Shanghai Gold Exchange. We'll have it. If you buy an ounce contract, it's backed by physical metal. And we'll establish it and make it the world's biggest gold bullion exchange, which they have done. But now we're going to start moving it across Europe, and we're going to start putting it into the Middle East. So that's what they do, and they do very well. It's starving the blood supply to the tumor. And the tumor is a great analogy for exactly what the cabal deep state is. So that's absolutely what needs to happen, and that's what we are seeing happening. And the problem is, people get frustrated and go, nothing's happening. I don't see anything happening. But these are all the things that have to happen and have been going on. That's why it isn't always exciting to talk about, well, there's developments in the Middle East, or there's developments in the Far East, or Russia's doing this, or China's doing that, whatever it might be. And we've discussed this, you have, and numerous other people, about all these developments, but they're all an important part of the process of draining the blood supply to the tumor. And that's exactly what's happening increasingly, and why we're starting to see more and more encouraging signs. And the idea there's going to be all these, like, they're just going to go and arrest every cabal member or anything simultaneously is never going to happen. But you're absolutely right. There is low-level people starting to be arrested. There is starting to see accountability. We can talk a bit about this today as well. And they're the encouraging signs, and they are very important signs, and that's how it will have to happen. Not this, we get it one day and there's 10,000 people being arrested. How exactly does that happen? How does the legal system process that? It's impossible. If you're going to arrest people, you're going to have a watertight case. Now, we may all think, well, this person or that person's banged to rights, and we might well be correct. But that doesn't mean in a legal system that's going to make that stick. So it has to be done watertight, and investigations take an awful long time, because you've got to make sure you do this correctly, because if you don't, there are people out there, we all know who they are, who might walk away on a technicality and won't serve justice as should happen. So people need to take that into consideration as well.
Absolutely, man. 1000% correct. People have this knee-jerk, axiomatic reaction and verbiage. Oh, it just needs to wreck everything, collapse everything, blah, 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 blah. They don't think very clearly that this is very complex, that it's not simple, and a quick quote unquote pulling the rug from the system will cause the type of catastrophe and chaos that nobody wants. Well, not the good guys, at least, and not those who are fighting the cabal. Because again, the point is this: you made it perfectly. These guys didn't come here to defeat the cabal, only to do what the cabal intended to do in the first place, which is wreck everything. It doesn't make any sense.
No, absolutely, and that is ultimate. I mean, that was their agenda in the Middle East. I mean, if we look through history, that's what the cabal do well. They go into nations. It's what I call the unholy trinity of death, destruction, and grand larceny. Correct. If you don't agree with them, they'll kill you. They'll destroy your entire nation and wreck it, and in the process, they'll steal any assets they can get their hands on. Perversely, that's what they do. Well, have done well in the past, less so now. And I mean, well, not in the sense that I agree with it, but that was their strength. Well, you don't play into their hands by doing precisely what they want to do. And this is why it's the same problem you have in Europe to do with all the immigration. That was engineered. We've said it before, but it's worth making the point again. They engineered the immigration crisis so Europe would be flooded. And in the process, they want to pitch the people of the UK against the immigrants that are coming in. Why? Because they want to stoke up tension. They want civil war. They want friction. They want anxiety. Then they can go and say, well, the country's complete chaos. There's rioting everywhere. We're going to have to take measures to deal with this. We can rightly then potentially bring in, say, martial law or some kind of variant of it. At the moment, all this whole idea, they're going to bring in martial law. So imagine them announcing on tomorrow in the UK, we're going to bring in martial law. Everyone would turn around and go, why? There's absolutely no need to have martial law. They can't bring something in unless they have a reason, and the reason is they want to stoke tension. They want riots. They want civil war. They want conflict and strife. That gives them the excuse to do things. If people don't rise to the bait and don't get involved in that, they have no reason. They have no justification to do it. I mean, we saw in the US where they were clearly trying to stoke tensions and trying to ban people holding firearms. It was pretty obvious what the agenda was, and it failed. Why? Because people didn't react to it. They could, and then they gave up on them. I mean, I wouldn't say they've totally given up on it, but pretty much they've stopped that idea. You don't really hear them talking about banning people holding guns and firearms anymore. It was, 2 or 3 years ago, it was on the news literally every other day. So now they've given up on that idea. Why? Because people didn't rise to the bait. And that's exactly what we need to do. So no, wrecking everything from our perspective is not a great idea, but for sure, that's what they have to take the wrecking ball. But taking a wrecking ball to the cabal doesn't mean literally, it's a metaphor for, as you say, you drain the blood supply to the tumor and eventually it withers and falls off and dies. And then they've gone. And that's increasingly what we're seeing. But it doesn't mean we don't have flashpoints, and we have. The Qatars, and we can talk briefly about that shortly. As much as a lot of the problems are being contained, there's still flashpoints, and it's still quite a volatile, risky situation. So they're not going to give up. Obviously they won't. But the less we retaliate militarily, the less we give them an excuse to use force. Because at the end of the day, they can't. People said, they'll just they created all these FEMA camps. They're going to round up 300 million Americans in 4 million square miles.
Right.
Just with no reason.
They couldn't do that with goat herders in Kabul, Afghanistan. Okay.
Precisely. It's not going to happen. But this was the fear that's being generated by people in the alternative media to scare people. That was what they were going to do. It's absolute nonsense. And if you're going to declare martial law of a population of 350 million in 4 million square miles, well, good luck trying to do that. You might be able to declare martial law for a day or two in one major city in the US, but you try and extrapolate that across the entire country. It's absolute nonsense. And they would never do it, because the one thing the cabal have always done is they've always had to do things in a very kind of stealth-like way and gradually introduce things. They can't be that overt, and particularly not now, because increasingly more and more people are waking up to the reality of what they've been doing and what they're up to. So their hands are tied even more than they ever have been.
Yep. Absolutely, man. Very well said, Paul. Very well said. So what is on the radar for today?
Well, we could talk for 10 hours, but let's talk. I mean, I heard CJ mention about the Italian banks, and it's quite interesting because on face value, people are going, oh, well, it's just kicking the can down the road. It's the same old, same old. But I think there's something quite different from my perspective. I mean, obviously, to put the background in, Italy's began winding up two failed regional banks, who were the Popolare di Vicenza, I think it is, and Veneto Banca. Now, they're only the 13th and 14th biggest banks in Italy, so they're pretty small. But the deal could ultimately end up costing the state up to 17 billion euros. But it'll leave, and what they intend doing is separating out the bad assets, which is most of the bank, but then giving the good assets in the hands of the nation's biggest retail bank, which is in the Intesa Sanpaolo. Mm-hmm. Now, the government's going to pay about 5 billion euros to Intesa and give it guarantees of up to 12 billion euros, so that it'll take over the remains of the two failed banks which collapsed, and that's after years of mismanagement, poor lending, same old story. So the total funds provided by the state are going to be about 17 billion euros, as we said. Apparently that's no surprise, 3 times more than it had initially been estimated. So there's a bit of background, but this is where it gets interesting, because the deal was approved by the European Commission, which flies in the face of how they said such bank should be handled. And what it does is allows Italy to solve the banking crisis on its own terms, which is exactly what the European Commission said, no, in future you're going to do as we want you to do. But it ensures that the two failed banks are kind of not wound down under what would have been far stricter European rules. Obviously, the problem is that the cost for taxpayers is huge. So that is the big downside. But the fact the European Commission's backed off is an indication that they realise, well, because the whole thing that we've heard for years, it's all about big bank bail-ins. We're going to have bail-ins. Well, this proves they're not having a bail-in. And what it means is that the two bank branches and all the employees are now effectively today part of this Intesa Sanpaolo. That will be a good move, because it will stop a potential run on deposits that could have spread chaos across the whole Italian banking industry. Now, this proves that the Italians and the European Commission have sat there and said, what's the best way to handle this? The European Commission's not being dictatorial and done what you would have expected them to do, which could have caused a banking crisis. They've actually done something that is actually common sense. If you want to stop a whole banking system collapse, and again, we're back in this scenario where, do we really want to see the Italian banking system collapse? Because if it does, the French banking system collapses, the European Union blows up, and very quickly so does the UK and the US. So, and people say, well, that's propping up the cabal. No, it isn't, because Europe's in a very different space. Now we're back to that point where there's a new European model that's been worked on. We talked about this previously. And this is another example where they don't want the financial banking system to just implode. I mean, yes, there is a risk things can happen, and if bigger banks implode, then it's a far more difficult situation to handle. But obviously the plan, what it means is there's all these soured loans which obviously exist on the balance sheets of these two banks, and there's obviously legal risks stemming from some mis-selling scandal. Now that's going to be moved to a to a bad bank, and that's partly financed by the state. Now, yeah, junior bondholders and shareholders in the two banks will suffer losses, but whether people like it, senior bondholders and depositors are going to be protected. So if you and I had money in these banks, we'll be protected. Under the old system, the chances are people would have come out with nothing and lost everything.
Right.
Now, for me, that's a more positive way of handling a very problematic situation. And I mean, there are some problems with this, unsurprisingly. I mean, there's a treasury source in Italy saying that the government expects that, of the 12 billion in guarantees, they're only going to have exposure of 400 million euros. And when someone asked them how, they couldn't give an answer. And the European Commission saying that the net cost to the Italian state will be much lower than the nominal amounts provided, but equally couldn't provide any explanation. But so there are certain problems with it, but in principle, it is a sensible move that, because also the thing with the soured loans, if they stick them in a bad bank, it might be possible, if someone actually uses their brain, that they could salvage some of the soured loans, and that could limit the final bill for taxpayers. I'm not saying you're going to salvage all of them, but you might salvage 10, 20%. Well, that's better than nothing. Now, the good thing from this Intesa Sanpaolo's point of view, it's open to purchasing the good assets on the condition that the Italian government passes the decree agreeing to shoulder the cost of winding down the two banks. Well, absolutely, because why would this bank want to take on the risk of imploding as a result of it? So from my perspective, it's a different standpoint. The European Commission's not bullying the Italians as they threatened to do previously, which was particularly with Monte dei Paschi, who's the fourth biggest bank. Now that was bailed out by the state because it had a capital shortfall of about 9 billion euros. Now, 4 of the smaller banks were wound down in 2015 in less than favourable conditions. So I think now, of course, where it's interesting is there's been a lot of toing and froing between Rome and the EU regulators and disagreements about how these banks should be held. Now, because the EU rules basically stated you can impose losses on senior bondholders and depositors, which would have been, well, the Italians said, we're not having it because we've got national elections next year. And given that Italian households hold a large chunk of bonds issued by banks, they're the senior bondholders, ironically, not the junior. So they have actually protected the Italian public's assets in the sense, okay, there's the taxpayer bailout, which is a bit unfortunate. But at the end of the day, if I had money in the bank, I'd rather they did that than say, okay, well, hang on, we'll just sink the banks and you'll lose all your deposits in the process. Now, of course, the question is how's this whole process going to be managed in terms of banking supervision, and the credibility of Europe's own rule for dealing with banking crises is now out the window, and everyone's foaming at the mouth because they don't realise, the European Union now realises it can't allow the banks to collapse, but it's for very different reasons than they were previously, where they were just kicking the can down the road. They're actually trying to provide a sensible solution, and I see this as a big sea change. It doesn't ultimately mean that the Italian financial system won't collapse. At some point, there is a big risk. There's far bigger kind of gremlins in the works in terms of Italy, and we've spoken before. Italy probably is likely to be the nation that ultimately will take the European Union down, which, if it does in terms of financial crash, because if it happens to the bigger banks, it's far harder to deal with it. But they've sensibly dealt with this, and I see that as a positive move, not a negative move. There are some teething problems, and nothing's perfect, but it's probably the best solution they could have made. And it shows for once a little bit of intelligence, and also allowing Italy to stake its sovereign claim to how it should deal things and not being bullied and railroaded as all the European nations have in terms of the European Commission or the European Central Bank or the European Union or any other organization that governs the Eurozone.
Absolutely. Absolutely correct. With that being said, Paul, the latest goings on in the Middle East, I'm sure you found it very amusing that America's finally, the deep state military industrial complex is finally waving the flag, and that forward operating base they had in southern Syria, which was set up hoping for the Saudis and the Sunni-backed terror groups would join up with the U.S.-led forces and cause some serious disruptions for the Syrian Assad-led forces. Has really backfired.
Oh, absolutely. And what was kind of interesting, I remember, I think going back maybe a month or two ago, I think the question got raised somewhere along the lines of when there was talk of the US and the Jordanians being on the Syrian border waiting to invade. And I said, it just won't happen. There's no way the Jordanians will do that. And noticed there was a comment over the weekend. There was that the Jordanians have said, we've got no intention of sending forces into Syria.
Right.
Because they know full well they're lambs to the slaughter. It would be an insane thing to do. And it's another example, as you said, the US are pulling out in terms of realizing, I mean, as we said previously, the Russians laid down the gauntlet and said, no more, this isn't going to happen. And the US have backed off. But this is where it gets interesting, because I mean, we can talk a little bit some developments with Qatar, but Tillerson has essentially said about Qatar, we don't want a war here. We want to find every diplomatic solution. Now that's the US official policy. Yeah, there'll be some, US intelligence agency operatives who see the opposite and all they want is war because that's all they understand. That's all they want. But this is why you get this contradiction. But the US official policy is we don't want war. We want to back off from this. We want to walk away from it. But you can certainly see, and I said to CJ before we came on air, if you look at what's happened in southern Syria, obviously the Syrian forces reached the border. Now they've opened it with Iraq, and it allows a supply line for the Iranians to move heavy weaponry from Iran using the main highway between Iraq and Syria. Now, interestingly, in one sense there was the saying follow the money, but now it's also follow the Daesh terrorists. Where are they going next? Because what did we see on the 7th of June? We had the terrorist attacks in Tehran on the Iranian parliament and the mausoleum of the Islamic Republic Imam Khomeini. Obviously, a number of people died, a lot of people were injured. Now what we're hearing is suddenly Daesh is springing up all over Iran. Now the Iranians have got a handle on it. I think they've rounded up well over between about 50 and 100 people linked to terrorist groups. A lot of them seem to be in the west of Iran, but not exclusively. And they're dealing with the problem as best they can. They've also confiscated a lot of ammunition, detonators, weapons, and they seem to have a handle on it. Now, it's no surprise the timing is pretty prescient, because what's happening is as soon as we see the southern borders being open, and it gives Iran far more ability to be able to move, troops and heavy weaponry into Syria, what do we see? Daesh springs up because it's a distraction. They're trying to destabilize Iran. They're trying to switch the Iranian focus and say, well, we could have a Syria on our hands. We're going to have to start drawing back from Syria and redeploying troops in Iran and dealing with the problem. And that's why this has happened. And it's another attempt to try and wrestle, victory from the certain jaws of defeat. So it's getting to the point, right, wherever you see Daesh getting involved, follow what they're doing, because it's a sure sign that they are trying to, in the case of Iran, destabilize the nation, and because they see obviously Iran as a serious threat in Syria. So that's something that kind of interests me, and I think it's something worth following going forward in the future with respect to Iran. Now, in terms of Qatar, obviously it's hugely positive, because we've had the recent shake-up in Saudi where the Crown Prince was deposed, Nayef, and King Salman's son was put in place, bin Salman. Now, of course, immediately we had these 13 decrees, which Qatar are going to look at and go, you must be joking. We're not, because effectively, if we agree to those, we're going to become a satellite of Saudi Arabia, and there's no way that's happening. Now, of course, the Iranians have responded and said, well, as far as we're concerned, this is not acceptable, and Tehran's going to stand by the Qatari government. Our airspace and everything will be open to the Qataris, and I'm sorry, but all these threats and sanctions are not solutions for resolving the problem. So that's not going to happen. You had Tillerson, as we said, who's trying to say, look, we need to have diplomatic solutions. We can't carry on. We need to lower the rhetoric to, avoid all the high tension that currently exists. You've got the Turks saying, well, actually, we're not removing our forces from the base. We stand by Qatar, and because what you're actually trying to invoke on this 13-point list is against international law, which of course is absolutely true, and therefore they're not going to close the Turkish base in Qatar. And now you've got the UAE, who's now sort of softening a bit, going, well, yeah, we've imposed this blockade, but we're not trying to force the country's leadership out. And and if you don't agree to these listed demands, well, we'll part our ways, and Qatar can leave the GCC. So you can already see that the UAE is starting to go into panic mode and going, well, actually, we don't want this regime change. In fact, because we're kind of frightened that if we start talking like that, maybe the Iranians and the Turks might invade UAE in the process, seeing as we seem to be in bed with the Saudis in this regard. So it's still a bit of a problem. I'm a little bit concerned that Qatar might blow into something in terms of a war. I'm not saying it's a certainty. I just think there's a risk of it. But it's more likely to just be some hot-headed action from the Saudis more than anything. But there is a risk. And of course, who's behind backing the Saudis? Who actually really wants to foment this war? That's the other problem that slightly concerns me. But there's a lot of strange things going on in terms of the Middle East. We had in Saudi where there was the terror plot that targeted the Grand Mosque in Mecca. Obviously, it failed. The Saudis are claiming it's of foreign origin. It might well be. It might well be just internally some faction who has had enough of the House of Saud. I mean, and this is the thing. There's people who are supportive of bin Salman. There's people who are supportive of Nayef, and there's people in between. And we're seeing why we see all these contradictory problems in nations where, I mean, what do we see? On the one hand, Saudi signing all these deals and lauding it with the Russians, saying we want energy deals, and then we hear the unbelievable comments that if the Russians don't sort things out in Syria and get out, we're going to launch our Saudi forces and we'll destroy the Russians in 3 days. I mean, it's absolutely farcical. But this is why you're getting all these contradictions, because I get people saying to me, but I'm hearing the Russians are dealing with the Saudi, but I'm hearing this. It's because all these nations are so hugely fragmented now. And that's why you're getting all these massive contradictions where one element in the country is supportive of what Russia's doing and wants to build relations. Another element doesn't want to build relations and wants to carry on and see the petrodollar survive. And there's other aspects in Saudi that says the petrodollar is dead and we want to move to trade, because China's our biggest oil trading partner. We want to move to the yuan and in terms of trading oil. So there's all these massive contradictions. And then, of course, we've seen the Israelis getting sort of involved in the Golan Heights. For anyone who's not aware, there's always a bit of a bone of contention between the Syrians and the Israelis. Now, we had a very strange incident where the Israelis destroyed these 2 tanks and this large caliber machine gun, which they believed was the Syrians. And then the Russians said, actually, no, it wasn't. You actually were attacking al-Nusra front, which must have been a bit of a surprise for the Israelis, because
that's their buddies.
yeah,
talking about fratricide. Fratricide. Oh man.
It's because, of course, they didn't realize they were carrying out these attacks against these al-Nusra Front militants. Now, what's interesting, of course, if you look at what happened, is they said they were responding to projectiles that were fired from the Syrian territory. Now, what a surprise! They hit the middle of no man's land in the northern Golan Heights. No injuries, no damage. So it's a classic. Let's launch a strike, and then you can have a preemptive strike back at Syria. And what happened? Of course, they actually destroyed the wrong people, and actually, well, they had Syrian tanks, but they'd stolen them or something had happened. But of course, they actually destroyed the al-Nusra front in the process. But what's interesting, of course, if you look in that whole area near the Golan Heights, there was a city of Bath which borders the Golan Heights. Now, at the time when the Syrian army were trying to repel this huge al-Nusra front attack, what the Israeli forces struck Syrian government forces this time, where the troops have been repelling this massive attack. So once again, we see these problems, and we had this situation where elements within the US military in southern Syria were attacking the Syrians, when we knew full well it was to allow terrorist elements, these militants, or maybe the so-called moderate rebels, to move out and go somewhere else. And that's the other thing, we see this repeated pattern. It doesn't matter whether the Israelis are attacking the Syrian forces whilst al-Nusra Front are having this conflict with the Syrian government. There's always this same pattern. It was the same, as we said, in southern Syria with the US forces and the questionable activity of what they were doing. But once again, that's another problem with the US military. It's completely fractured. There's people inside the US military going, what the hell's going on? We need to start accounting for what is actually happening there. And then there's other elements that probably through the intelligence services are going, no, these are the coordinates, this is what we need to do. And this is why we're getting these complete mixed messages in terms of what's going on. And you've got the Israelis on the one hand who are doing this, and then there's elements within the Israel who are saying, we don't want regime change, we don't want to attack the Syrians, we're not interested in that. But obviously if anyone sort of bombs our territory or launches these projectiles, we're going to respond in kind. So, and the element is, well, did the Israeli forces respond in kind? be based on bogus intelligence and not realize who was responsible, because his interest in the end ended up obviously destroying al-Nusra front equipment, which must have been quite, the Russian military must have enjoyed telling the Israelis what they'd done.
Yeah, absolutely. It's pretty funny, like, Lavrov, after that whole entire Su-22 shoot down, Lavrov said enough's enough, and all of a sudden, suddenly, Paul, the carrier deck, the aircraft deck that's on the USS George Washington is very quiet. Nothing's moving there.
No, absolutely. And the other thing that's increasingly coming around, we've talked about the deficiencies in the US military in terms of their equipment, but more and more of their hardware is just failing.
Yeah.
Or just, it's either failing or, I mean, I've heard they're supposed to be taking a load of frigates out that have been mothballed back into operation, because they're the only ones that actually work. All this state-of-the-art stuff with the massive refurbishments just don't work anymore.
Yeah, correct.
I mean, it's incredible to see.
Yeah.
But I think, but without a doubt, the US military are backing off.
You saw the latest aircraft carrier that they're trying to put out. It's an aircraft carrier that can't carry airplanes.
I mean, yeah, it's incredible.
It's just, I love it. Oh man.
So yeah, without a doubt. I mean, and I think it's probably a good time to mention. I was going to mention it a week or two ago, and we kind of ran out of time, but we've got time to talk about it. Is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? It's not often spoken about, but obviously, in essence, it's not exactly, but it's pretty much an alternative to NATO. Now, as we know, India and Pakistan historically have not had great relations over the whole disputed Kashmir territory since the end of the war, and they've actually had 4 wars in that time. But they've obviously both become full members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and that's led by China and Russia and the former Soviet Stan republics. So there's Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. Now there's talk that they want to get Iran as a fully paid up member. Now, if you look at any map of the Far East and the Middle East, if you go and stretch, if you look at how the Shanghai Cooperation Organization operates, it goes all the way from China through all the Central Asian republics. They've got Afghanistan as a kind of observer member. You've got Pakistan and India, Iran to join, and you can see how this movement's going gradually from east.
You mean China and Russia, thanks to the New Silk Road and the SCO and the One Belt One Road initiative, have basically captured all the countries that were the cabal's so-called failed the Caspian pipeline deal. They got that without firing a shot. Is that what you're telling me, Paul?
Yes, quite. And this is exactly back to the point. You don't go around blowing things up to win. They've had a strategy for years, and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is growing and expanding for one big, huge reason. And because we talked about the movement of Daesh and the Islamic State into Iran has been a potential problem, but there's been problems in the Stan republics. We know there's problems in Afghanistan. There's something interesting we'll talk about in a second with Afghanistan that part of it amused me, which you'll understand why in a sec. But if you look at that, there is these problems. They know full well this, and we've talked about this. This global terrorist threat is the hot war of the 21st century, and they're realizing that there's problems in the Stan republics. There's movement to try and destabilize it. There's movements to try and destabilize Europe, which I talked about. I won't go into the detail of it because it was on one of the subscription podcasts, which I only became aware of recently, which is a huge development in terms of how they're trying to foment a kind of terrorism in Europe as well. So it's this kind of movement where they know they're starting to fail in Syria. They know Iraq's starting to fail. So they're now starting to expand their horizons. That's why the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is growing and expanding, and why Russia's putting military bases in nations and starting to be supportive of the likes of Afghanistan as well. And to talk about Afghanistan's quite interesting, because we remember the whole Tora Bora cave complex and how Osama bin Laden was supposed to be hiding there, and they could never root these people out, and these caves were this massive network. It was impossible. Well, in a matter of weeks, the Afghan military have just pushed all the Daesh terrorists out and got rid of them. Funny how they managed to do it so quickly. but the US couldn't do it. And interestingly, the Taliban have said that we'll have peace talks in Afghanistan provided the US leaves. They're quite happy for the Russians to be there, but they want the US out. And of course, the president, or the former president, Afghan president, Kazar, has said that they need to start increasing efforts to withdraw US military because they feel they're antagonizing what's going on in with respect to the Taliban. Well, of course, we know that the US, its big opium production fields, all the opium fields in Afghanistan that were protected by US soldiers. It's a horrible thing to say, but it's absolute reality. And of course, there's a huge amount of concern because the Russians have reported in Afghanistan that there was all these unidentified helicopters flying all over Afghanistan, controlled by extremists, Daesh or whoever, apparently dropping things off and returning to their bases with US soldiers. And the Russians have reported this to the US. And obviously elements within the US have tried to say, oh, this is nothing. But you can imagine the Trump administration is going, what the hell's going on? Afghanistan's asking Russia to, provide services, logistical support. But the ultimate thing that absolutely just is the icing on the cake is that Daesh is saying that it's going to eliminate militants of the Taliban terrorist group, particularly in Afghanistan. So Daesh wants to move to take control of Afghanistan. Why? Because it clearly wants to control the opium production. The Taliban, which may surprise people, have actually tried to destroy all the opium fields in the past, which is why the US previous administrations hated them so much. So now we've got a situation where Daesh wants to go to war with the Taliban. And that shows how completely insane the world's become. I mean, I wouldn't give Daesh much chance of destroying the Taliban, but it's kind of interesting that why you're seeing the Russians moving in, why Afghanistan is an observer state in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which means it's very much protected. It might not be a full member, but it will have protection because the Russians and the Chinese are fully aware that that's exactly what Daesh were going to do at some point. They'd move into Afghanistan. It's why all these other stands were signed up previously, because they knew that was the plans. I mean, these plans to foment caliphates, not only in the Middle East, across Europe, and all the Stan republics, has been known by the Russians and Chinese for years, and that's why they're making these moves. But I mean, it just shows the desperation for Daesh to say we're going to start, actually to declare war on the Taliban. It's absolutely incredible.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And it's amazing that when you have the global disruptor, which is the cabal, out of play, and you actually allow stabilizing forces to come in, like Russia and China, things get fixed very quickly. We've seen it in the breakaway regions in Crimea, Donetsk, and we've seen it in Syria. We're witnessing it in Syria. We're seeing it all over the world. It's like the multipolar world is here, Paul. It's the genie's out of the bottle. There's no way they could put this back in.
No, absolutely, and that's why the multipolar world is really the antidote, and is what's draining the blood supply to the tumor. I'm going to really stick with that analogy. I like that. It's fantastic. But it's absolutely true. And that's the whole point of a multipolar world, is because nations are realizing, do you know what? We don't have to go to war anymore. We've got nations like China and Russia who want to just trade with us, want to do mutually beneficial things that will benefit us and benefit them. And, if we're a weaker nation, they're also prepared to protect us militarily because they're aware of the terrorist threat. That's a future. I mean, the whole idea of World War III is so archaic because that's not how wars in the future will be fought. The wars of the future is global terrorism and cyber terrorism. They're the big risks of the future. And the Russians and the Chinese are aware of this. They're certainly aware of it. I think the West is gradually starting to become a bit more aware of the fact. Yeah, we all know there's all these supposed, false flag terrorist attacks that, such as what's happened in the UK recently. But there's a far bigger terrorist threat which is globally coordinated, and their design is to cause massive chaos across the Western world and beyond. Now, that is the big threat. Chinese and the Russians telegraphed it years ago, and that's why they're doing what they're doing. I think finally people within the US administration are waking up to the reality of what's going on. Who knows what intelligence has been shared to people, or what things have been said by the Russians, particularly to the Americans. We know there's certainly back channels in terms of, from a military perspective, where they're trying to keep things quiet, but they're certainly cooperating with each other. And it's debatable exactly what's being said. But I think there's a bit of a realization now that there are major threats and we have to take them seriously. So nations across the world who've previously not gone on it, and India and Pakistan are two great examples. I mean, they're not really exactly friendly, and they've had a lot of very bad history between them. But they've joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They've been told by China, you're just going to behave like civilized adults. You're going to get over your differences and realize there's mutual threats that are posed to both of your nations, and you need to take it seriously. And we'll be supportive of you. But if you start to tear strips off each other as you've done in the past, you're on your own. And if they're on their own, the risk is very detrimental. So they're starting to wake up and realize that's not reality anymore. So in the process as well of moving across the Far East and the Middle East, and with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, they're healing wounds in the process between nations who actually largely have been at war with each other because of the cabal. Because of course that's what the cabal do best. Keep nations at each other's throats. Why? Because divide and conquer. It's an old cliche, but it's never true a statement. That's how they've won wars. That's how they've divided the world and managed to have nations fighting against each other on the basis of all spurious reasons. But that's their agenda and their MO. But that MO is starting to fail because the multipolar world is the absolute antidote to that problem.
Absolutely. The multipolar world is the only thing that's going to bring so many people out of the misery and the doldrums of that they're in. And that's when you're going to start seeing a lot of these nations really developing, which is the complete opposite of these Western Kabbalists, especially what was uttered by the mouth of that fat, pestilent swine of a man, Maurice Strong, who's not very strong at all, Paul. Maurice Strong, when he said, "We cannot allow any nation to be industrialized like the United States. Can't allow it." And now nations all over the world are not only being industrialized, but they are linking up their economies with the entire One Belt, One Road initiative. They're having the lifeblood, the blood supply is being reverted from the tumor back to the host, back to the organism, man. I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I put a big article. I know you referenced it way back when I put on the website to do with the One Belt, One Road. And I had people going, well, why are you telling me this? What's the point of it? That is the lifeblood of the new world. That in essence is the blueprint of what this is all about. And there's a lot of other things that need to be built into that economically, politically, socially. And there's, of course, but that is in essence is the backbone of the new world. And the US are gladly welcome to join it, and we certainly are hearing positive signs with regards to China, at least privately. But a lot of people say I'm not seeing anything really changing in the US. Well, the one thing we're seeing, the Democrats' rabid obsession with Russia, is they're eviscerating as a party
yes,
completely. And American people, even a lot of pro-Democrats, are going, do you know what? I am sick to death of hearing this bullshit about Russia. What we want to hear is what jobs, healthcare, infrastructure, how are you going to rebuild America and make it a strong nation amongst equals again? I don't want to hear this nonsense anymore. Right. And, we had the thing with CNN, and I see it as quite, in essence, people go, oh, well, it's a small thing. But we had CNN doing the reporting saying there was alleged ties between the Russian Direct Investment Fund, the RDIF, and the Trump team. The usual, oh, there's all the, no smoke without fire between the Russians and Trump. And of course, an RDIF spokesman said, hang on, this is absolute nonsense. The fund works in fully compliance with all legal requirements and doesn't violate US sanctions regime. What the hell are you talking about? And then suddenly, the CNN takes the article down.
Yep.
But, almost a sort of apology of sorts, and then says in future, well, actually, we'll have to pay more attention to what we put out. This is huge. This is a huge climb down for CNN to do this, and it's indicative of draining the blood supply away, because the media is the one thing the cabal have used deftly to control people's opinions, control people's views about things, to control the whole kind of narrative about whatever they want to do. And this is the start where you're seeing the backbone of the mainstream media really is collapsing. We're seeing it in audience figures, but now when they're starting to have put out information, they're having to retract it. it's another great example of the kind of changes that are starting to come about. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned about Sanders, and of course that's an interesting, well, not particularly to do with Sanders, but with his wife. And I was saying to CJ before we came on air, apparently this goes back a lot further. Goes back into the early part of 2016 when the FBI was supposed to be investigating the issue to do with this 32-acre campus and to do with where they were saying that they'd misrepresented $2 million worth of pledges in order to borrow $10 million to finance deals. Now, of course, we kind of had these FBI investigations. We're not sure exactly where they were going. And then suddenly out the blue, we hear that apparently Sanders' wife's hired these high-profile lawyers, and the Trump administration is going to announce, or apparently allegedly supposed to be going to announce, a federal attorney that's going to prosecute the case. We'll wait and see what happens. But this is another huge change. You would never have seen this happen in previous administrations. It just wouldn't. It would have got buried and disappeared. There may have been some investigation. It would have just, basically disappeared in a puff of smoke. No one would have heard any more about it. Now, we'll obviously have to follow and see exactly what happens in the case of Sanders. Why? But isn't it a small glimmer of change? And it's once again, it's you're not going to see suddenly 1,000 people arrested in all these high-profile cases. You'll start to see individual cases. Things start to get in the public domain. It'll start to change people's perspective when 1 happens and 10 happens and 20 happens. But it's not going to happen overnight. And it has to be done correctly because, whatever people may think, Sanders' wife has to have, if she ends up being prosecuted, if it goes to trial, it has to be a fair trial. And if she's guilty, she's guilty. If she's not guilty, she's not guilty. It's not a question of, oh, well, it's Sanders' wife, so let's just prosecute her. Because, if we're going to change the world, we have to get past this thing of just prosecuting people or stitching them up just for the sake of it because we don't like them. There's plenty of people in the UK I don't like, but unless there's something to stick on them, you can't just put them in prison. We have to do things correctly, so we have to go through due process. Due process takes a long time, and if in this case it does end up going to court and then she's found guilty, she's found guilty. If she's innocent and evidence proves she is, and she doesn't go to prison, or vice versa. And we have to be very clear about this. It's not a question that everybody we think's guilty of something is guilty of something. Yes, there are certain people undoubtedly in the political system across the Western world who we very much know are guilty of many things. But in this situation, due process has to take place, and we have to be honest and fair about how any trial happens, if it does happen. But in the process, what's more interesting to me is it's starting to hear these things. It's starting to get into the mainstream media. And now people in the US and beyond are starting to go, hang on. Okay, so this is happening. When it starts happening 5, 10, 15 cases, it changes people's perspective. And that's the biggest thing is people talk about having revolutions in nature. Revolutions never work if you go to war. Revolutions only work when all the things that people believe in, all the things they hold true, and their refusal to compromise that is when they flip and go, I don't believe that anymore. I believe this because I know it to be true. When you have a revolution in an individual's mindset, it spreads amongst other people. In the end, it becomes a majority. And then you have the revolution in consciousness and understanding of how the US works, how the UK works. Then that's when you have a revolution. The difference is it's a bloodless revolution. You don't need it because then sufficient people will say, we're not tolerating this anymore. And once that tipping point's reached, the political system, the financial system, everything changes. But if people want a revolution and go to war, we've had revolutions in history, but most of them were engineered by the cabal, including the Russian Revolution is a great example. The Russian people thought they were emancipated from the Tsars without realizing they were running into the clutches of communism, which was a Western cabal edict and design.
Yeah.
And throughout history, we've seen that a lot of these so-called revolutions
were not even Russian.
Yeah. No, exactly. And it is through history. So it's a revolution in people's perspective that instead of standing there while, there's people listening who might listen to, not the general audience, but you might get some people new to it, will go, I simply don't believe this. This is absolute rubbish. But gradually over time, they start to go, no, actually, I believe this. That makes sense. I can see that's tangible. I see that's real. and their whole mindset changes. And when one person's mindset changes, the people around them, they'll start to talk to them, and it influences people in a positive way. But that takes a long time. You can't force people to want to listen and want to change. They have to want to change themselves.
Yeah.
And that's the only way. That then it becomes a permanent thing. I mean, all the people who listen and all of us, we didn't get it rammed down our throats to believe in things. We found out things, we understood things, we saw the world for what it is. And now we fully understand, we fully comprehend what's happening. Okay, there's still things that will surprise us in the future, no doubt. There's going to be a lot of things eventually we'll find out that will surprise all of us still. But by and large, we know how the world pretty much operates. And nothing's going to change us from that. But if you force someone and you bully someone into believing it, very soon they'll just walk away from it and go, I don't believe this. And that's another reason why that's the kind of, it's a revolution in people's belief systems that will ultimately change everything. And I do have confidence when you see a lot of American people are saying, we've had enough of Russia, we want to see the country rebuilt, we're sick of what's coming out of the Democrats' mouth. That hasn't taken long. 6 months ago, there's a lot of people in the US who were very foaming at the mouth about Trump, foaming at the mouth about the Russians, but that's starting to change. So we're seeing this seed change, but it takes a long time. It's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And there's going to be a new Supreme Court justice. It looks like Kennedy is retiring. That's going to be fun, and that gives Trump a chance to stack it with his guys.
And that's the other thing. That's a really good point. Is there's a lot of people who are from previous administrations who may be cabal, maybe not cabal, but maybe sucked into the cabal way of thinking. And as people start to leave and people retire, it opens up doors, and you can put other people in position. I mean, I think a great example of that is, obviously, I mean, we haven't got time to talk about it, but Trey Gowdy, who's been appointed the US House of Representatives Oversight and Government Reform Chairman. Now, you can certainly see with him in place, it's not going to happen overnight, but you're going to start seeing changes. He's going to look at things differently. As we've seen him, he's very good at interrogating people and asking the right questions and trying to drive the right answers. He doesn't always get them, but he's an example of someone who can start to make a huge change inside the system, because there are going to be people within the system who are now going, well, do you know what? I've never quite believed this. Hang on, I've got someone I can latch onto and I can believe in because I want to do things correctly. Equally, you're going to get people who won't or be resistant to it, but those who are resistant are going, the blood supply is being drained to them, and they're going to get weaker and weaker and weaker, and eventually they'll just fall off. The tumor will die. And in that regard, but I think people like Gowdy being put in this position will make a big difference, and we'll start to see that. But it's going to take weeks, months. Who knows? It might take a year or two. I don't know. I mean, the pace of change is huge, but equally, the pace of change within a country the size of the US, with 350 million people and 4 million square miles, and all their involvement in global affairs, having the reserve currency, it's a massive job. It's a monumental job and from the Chinese perspective, it was a lot easier to start from scratch and build a new nation, build a new ethos, reignite the One Belt, One Road. But from the US perspective, they've got a broken system in every regard, and they've got to try and fix it. That's a monumentally difficult job. I mean, as much as people may criticize Trump, who would want to really be the US president now? I mean, not that I'm a US, but if I was a US citizen, someone came to me and said, would you be the US president? I go, you must be joking.
Mm-hmm.
Because it is such an incredibly difficult job. I mean, it's difficult enough to turn the oil tank around, but when you've got someone trying to hold the wheel and stop you doing it, which is increasingly getting a little bit easier. We had a sticky spell March time when the Washington machinery seemed to be taking a large amount of control again, but we spoke at the time that there was moves to change that, and we'd see personnel start to move out of position and more kind of Trump-friendly people put into positions. That's starting to happen more in earnest. We've had some more changes in the US State Department in that regard. But now you've got those changes. That's all well and good, but then you have the additional problem that the US State Department's now kind of at loggerheads with certain people in the US intelligence services. So it's one thing to change a department itself in terms of the internal mechanism of the US State Department. But then you've got to add the fact, well, okay, if we've got that under control, hang on, now we're going to have to deal with the US intelligence services who are at, to some extent are at loggerheads with us because we have a different perspective. We have a softer line. We want to change our perspective on how we deal with Russia. And the US intelligence services are basically, a lot of them are still saying, no, as far as we're concerned, Russia's the bogeyman, and we're going to have to keep putting more and more sanctions on them in the process. So that's just a small example of the problems that the Trump administration faces. It's monumental. It's huge. So when I hear these people going, "Oh well, as soon as Trump takes over, it's the end of the cabal," it totally detracts from the fact just how huge this kind of network was and how it spanned the entire U.S. financial, political, and social system and beyond, and interlinks with other elements in Europe and beyond that. And I mean, China and Russia took a decade or more to clean the ranks, and that was just through NGOs and people, not actually a governing body that was inside their country, but they had problems, and they took them long enough. So it's a long haul job, and I think I don't want people to think it's not going to happen, because yes, it will, but it's fraught with problems. It's going to take a long time, and these people who keep saying, "Oh, next week, the US military are just going to take over and round up the cabal and remove it," it's never going to happen. And the sooner people accept the reality that these things aren't going to happen, but there is progress being made, then it manages their expectations better. And that's what I find the most frustrating, is people's expectations being completely mismanaged by people. And now they get frustrated, and because they get frustrated, they've all switched off and given up and gone, it's never going to happen. Nothing's changing. And not actually realizing the reality of what's unfolding, and it's important. But equally as important is, in a new world, it's up to the American people to change their nation. It's not up to, Trump can do what he can do, the US administration can, but, it's going to be the hard work of the American people that ultimately, however long that takes, that will change them as a nation. It's the same in the UK. The UK has many problems the US has, not to the same extent, because obviously it's a smaller nation. So, in real terms, it's less of a problem. But we have huge problems as well. Europe has huge problems. But Europe's already identified that and is working to make those changes. But you're not going to see them necessarily, but occasionally you'll see something that comes out and you go, oh, hang on. So Germany's saying that with, it's like the whole thing with the sanctions, and Germany and Austria made a big song and dance. We talked about it previously to do with the Nord 2 stream, but that's a great example. You're starting to see elements within the German administration that are saying, we're not tolerating this anymore. We're not putting up with it. You'd have never heard that 12 months ago, even 6 months ago. So these are great examples. I mean, Macron's another enigma that's kind of, he's really, I said, and I got a lot of people getting in touch going, you must be mad for saying he might be a Rothschild shoe-in, but he's not. He doesn't seem to be behaving like one. He's very much actually at the moment not behaving like a Rothschild shoe-in.
He's not. He's backing off the whole, Russia thing. He's backing off of Syria. He's, in calls with Putin.
Yeah, and also the other thing is he's finding there's people in his administration who are less than clean, and he's removing them. 4 have gone already. Sorry, you're not. There's this hanging over you, or maybe there's some investigation. Right, you're gone. This is a change, and this is where the world's different. Everyone says, "Oh well, Macron was this," so, and he worked in the Rothschild banks, and he's clearly a Rothschild shoe-in now. But that's a bit of an oversimplification. The world's not the way it is, and even with respect to the Rothschilds, I think they don't. The Rothschilds themselves are very split. For a long time, there's been elements within the Rothschilds who wanted to end all this. They wanted to walk away and said, no more, this is insane. We don't want to be part of this, whatever the Rothschilds actually do. And that's another big question that no one actually really knows. There's a lot of ideas that they control things, which actually they don't control. And there's things they do control that people don't think they control. So again, it's far more complicated. But certainly within the younger generations, they want out of it. They want an end to it. They said, we're sick of this. It's insane. What the hell's the point of this? And this is why the senior members of the family were, they were supposed to have heirs to the throne, so to speak. And they're now realizing that these people are just not up to the job because they just don't want to do it. They've had enough. So it's not a clear-cut case that everybody who's a Rothschild or part of that environment is all pro-cabal. It's not. That these changes have come about as well, and that's partly also restricted the blood flow to the tumor, because these people have actually destabilized these families in the process because they have a very different attitude and want to change. So as I said, it's nothing's that clear cut. You made a point, I can't remember, I was listening one day when you said, and you were very passionate, and you were going on about this whole black and white thing. Right. Everyone sees things black and white. Everything in the world is grey, and when it comes to the cabal, there's many, many shades of grey. Nothing is black and white. So if you think that Putin's talking to the IMF, he's cabal? No. Does it mean the people he's talking to in the IMF are cabal? No. Maybe he is talking to people who are cabal, who are now realizing the world's going to change. It's not that simple. There's a lot of Trojan horses that exist within all these, what people think are cabal entities, which is partly also the reason why the blood supply is being drained to them. And equally, there's plenty of organizations and people out there that no one's ever heard of, who are major players in terms of the cabal, have been in families for decades, and individuals that no one will have ever heard of, who have been hugely influential. And there's no point mentioning names because it achieves nothing, but there's also people who've been very influential in protecting and supporting Trump and preventing the Washington machinery railroading him. People have never heard of these people, but they like it that way. They don't want to be known. There's a lot of people who are making major changes in the world, all over the world. No one knows who they are. I referred to them once way back as calling them ghosts, and that's exactly what they are. They just ghost in and out of places. They do what needs to be done. No one knows who they are. They don't want to ever know. And when the world change, they'll just disappear and do something else, and no one will have ever heard of them. And that's the way it should be.
Yeah.
This isn't about, egos and, people lauding it to the world about how they saved the world. That's not what this is about. It's about changing the world for a better future. And that's what these people want to aspire to and work to. And a lot of them made huge sacrifices in doing this. They've worked for a long time to achieve those objectives. And there must have been times when they wanted to give up and felt they were never going to make any progress, but they've stuck at it. They've worked hard, and now we're starting to reap the benefits. But we have some way to go. And rather like the Russians are in Syria, you don't rest on your laurels. You don't think you've won yet. The war in Syria was probably over in reality 6 months ago, but it's not over yet, and it won't be over for a while. But you just have to keep going and have to keep persevering to achieve those objectives, and be aware that there are problems likely to come about elsewhere in the world because of what's happened in Syria, as you point out, in Iran and the former Russian Republic. Exactly. That global terrorist threat is not going to go away, and probably long after the cabal have gone, it will still be a problem. But the great thing is, if it's still a problem, imagine when you've got the US, Europe, Russia, China, Iran, all the big sort of military nations in the world going, right, we've got a problem in this region of the world, and they send a united task force to go and deal with it. I mean, it will be over with immediately. It's a great thing if the US had cooperated in Syria from day one when Trump took over, the war would have been over infinitely quicker. Mm-hmm. That's the difference. Right. That's the whole sea change in the mindset. And that's what we need to remain focused on and be positive about. But yeah, there are challenges. There's always been challenges. It's been that way, for years. But from my perspective, and I've said this before, that the cabal lost the war 5 years ago. But rather like the Germans lost the war when they invaded Russia, it took 4 more years for that war to end. And that's the basis, the same principle. Wars don't end overnight. And it's rather like the Berlin Wall. It came down, but think about what went on before the Berlin Wall came down. It didn't all just happen overnight. It was going on for years beforehand.
Yep. Absolutely correct, man. Paul, we're at the end of the program. Why don't you give out your website again, your services, and how people could contact you via social media?
Well, first off, thank you very much for saying so. I mean, we've got obviously the SiriusReport.com, SIRIUS. That's the website. There's all free material on that. Yes, we do have the premium subscription service, which is $4.75 or equivalent a month, depending on where you live in the world. You get 22 podcasts, roughly 5 a week. So in a calendar month, 22. They're 10 to 15 minutes each one. We think they're very packed full of information. People often say I have to listen to it 2 or 3 times because I don't waste words in it. I say the minimum amount of words to get the maximum amount of information out. So, but we think it's very good value for money, and we thank everyone who's subscribed already and support us. Obviously, we've got the YouTube channel, which is a little bit underutilized, but that's the London Paul channel. We have the Facebook page, although we just created a Facebook group today, which we're going to move towards that platform rather than having a Facebook group, which is a lot of time which we don't have to spend. I'd rather spend time far more productively in terms of which we think the Facebook group would be more productive. I think it's a better way forward for us. I know people might disagree, but you know, there's only the two of us working on it. We don't have the hours in the day to be able to do everything, and we want to maximize the time we do spend in the most productive ways. So we've kind of launched that, which we you know, people will be able to find quite easily. If they go to the website, etc., we'll put all that information up. And, you know, we've got the Twitter page at the SiriusReport.com. Sorry, at the Sirius Report, not the .com at the end. And, you know, when we thank, you know, Rogue Money for getting us to come on, we enjoy doing it every week. And, you know, and it's more power to everyone's elbow that we all join together and get the truth out there and the reality of what's going. And we do all support each other, and we work equally hard in many different ways to get the message out to people of what's going on. And you know, we thank everyone for the support that they've given us, because without it, it'd be pointless. If we didn't have the support, we'd be wasting our time. But we know we're doing the right things because we do get a lot of positive feedback, as undoubtedly Rogue Money does as well, for exactly the same reasons.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Paul, again for being on, and thank you all for listening in. Tune in next week, same time. It will again be the Sirius Report, and Paul will have a whole litany of things to cover next week as well. Thank you all for listening in. Take it away, CJ.